We forget that war is an imperfect effort, that war is a confusing thing and a horrible thing, and there's going to be collateral damage. And when you go and drop bombs on ISIS, you're going to kill some civilians, kill some kids, you're going to kill some women, and it's awful. And it is the reality of war. When you have pure evil in the world, somebody has to take care of that problem.
You once said that when a nation goes to war, they have to be prepared for two big things, and one is they have to be prepared to kill and then prepared to die.
Let me make that perfectly clear. Family was not my number one priority. I didn't even want to think about my family for a second, because that second might be the time that I thought of something that's going to make us perform better on the battlefield. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to go into combat. I'd be grossly lying. And when it happened, I was happy it was happening. And when we were done, I wanted more. The biggest challenge in combat is leadership. And leadership is dealing with other people and trying to figure out what's making them work or where the friction is in the team. So when you're working with a business, it's the same thing. Don't talk to me about, oh, well, it was easy for you because you had these highly trained, highly disciplined Terminator robots that work for you. Not true. In fact, the opposite. I had a bunch of hard-headed, very determined, thick-skulled guys that I had to get them to do what I wanted them to do. Because if you push your guys too hard in combat, they're gonna break. Sometimes I went a little far and said, ooh, wow, I just saw the look on that guy's face. He needs a rest. And I should have recognized that earlier. And you know, you make mistakes. People want to own their own destiny. They want to be in charge of what's happening. They want to take ownership. They want to create the plan. That's how they want to go through life. They want to be treated like a human.
Say Trump got elected and he calls you up and says, Jocko, we'd like you to go back in and we're actually going to take care of this time. Do you have any interest in that scenario?
Yeah, I'd do that.
You would do that?
Absolutely.
Take extreme ownership of your life and join us on the Business Accelerator program. Take your idea, turn it into a product, and then into a business. It's 8 weeks of private mentoring, 2 hours of live calls every week where I make you accountable. It's a sick peer group of our entire cohort. Click on the link below, submit your application, or go to londonreelacademy.com/biz, B-I-Z, and I hope to see you, and I hope you join us. London Real, sponsored by Bulletproof. I often get asked the question, who is the most intense guest I've ever had at London Real Studios? And we have a new winner, because that honor goes to Mr. Jocko Willink, who is a U.S. Navy SEAL and author of the book Extreme Ownership. Jocko has an incredible past, which includes commanding Team Unit Bruiser in the 2006 Battle of Ramadi in Iraq. He then went back and ran all of the West Coast Navy SEAL training operations, retired, and now he consults with businesses about how they can take extreme ownership of everything they do. And Jocko is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he is a very intimidating guy. He describes himself as looking like a serial killer. I'd say that's fairly accurate. And I was really affected by Jocko, really more after the episode, because I went through and read his entire book, and I've now listened to quite a few of his podcasts. And it's just fascinating to me what we can learn from the military about managing businesses and managing people. And as Jocko said, most people think that he's got an easy job in the military because he's surrounded by a bunch of Terminator robots that do whatever he says. And he says, no, that's not true. He has to convince people, cajole, manage, manipulate them to do what he wants to do. And that's what any effective leader does. And there are so many lessons to be learned here. And I think so many misconceptions about what the military is and the military isn't that Jocko opens up and talks about. And we covered pretty much everything on this episode as far as what it was like for him to initially go into Iraq and what he learned at the very, very difficult times in the Battle of Ramadi. And if you're not familiar with it, he was ordered to take Iraqi soldiers with him on missions that sometimes didn't even know how to count, let alone their loyalties were questionable, and sometimes they couldn't even speak the same language. And a lot of the lessons that he learned, which are lessons that I am now putting into practice at London Real, which includes decentralizing command, prioritize and execute, leading up the chain of command, leading down the chain of command. There are so many lessons to be learned from Jocko here, and I think it's really only a matter of time until his practices are used so many different places in the world. So it was a real pleasure to be around him. I don't think they make them like Jocko anymore. And I think he is probably one of the best at what he does and what he's seen. So strap in for a lot of fascinating life lessons, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. A lot of people have asked me about London Real, and you know, what we do is more than just interviews that go out on YouTube and iTunes. We actually have an entire academy of over 1,000 people worldwide that connect with each other and push each other to be the best versions of ourselves, to upgrade our peer groups and to go for our goals. We have summit meetings where hundreds of us meet up here in London and around the world and really get to know each other and make these core relationships that will last a lifetime. And a lot of people ask me more about it, and here's a few scenes from behind the cameras.
The entrepreneurial journey, it can be a lonely road. I push myself in so many areas, but you know, you can't do it all yourself.
The thing about the academy is, it's like, look, you have the ideas, you have the ability, you have the skill, and you have the sort of ambition for yourself. But when you have a group of people pulling you forward, it's so important.
Accountability is what's missing from most of the programs or any gurus or any internet mentor that I had before.
I wanted to get some accountability. I wanted to make myself accountable to a group, to you.
The reason we started the Academy is because I felt like we were doing these amazing talks, like we'd have a Peter Sage episode or a Dan Pena episode or a Kala or someone, and you get super inspired, and then YouTube stops, and then you go back to your life and you don't make any changes. And it was just like, what? It felt like, what are we doing? If you're designing your life right, the good times are now. And in a few years, you'll look back and say, wow, that was amazing.
The thing about the academy is it has so many different sort of layers to it. I think your web seminars are awesome. The way you broke it down and the style of your teaching is pretty awesome.
I like the feed. When I have to motivate myself, I kind of look at others struggling and getting over those struggles. So I actually follow daily the feed.
Best feature would be the sort of Facebook aspect of it, the social media aspect of it, as in creating a profile with your goals, your dreams.
Everyone's on the same vibe, and we may be at different stages in our journeys, but everyone's on the same page at the end of the day. Everyone's really trying to push themselves and building the best you. It really resonates with me.
And the fact that I'm committing a small amount of money and the fact that I'm actually trying to interact with those people means that I'm invested and means that I will keep it for the long run.
You have to be serious about yourself and what you want to achieve. And if you're serious about yourself, this is going to be such a fantastic platform.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Jocko Willink, who is a retired Navy SEAL officer and author of the #1 New York Times and #1 Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Extreme Ownership: How U.S. Navy SEALs Lead and Win. You spent 20 years in the Navy SEALs, where you rose to become the commander of Task Unit Bruiser, the most highly decorated special operations unit of the Iraq War, where you were awarded both the Silver and Bronze Star. Afterward, you returned home to become the officer in charge of training for all West Coast SEAL teams. In 2010, you retired from the Navy and launched Echelon Front, where you teach the leadership principles you learned on the battlefield to help companies lead and win. You're also a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and an avid surfer. Jocko, welcome to London Real.
Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure having you. You know, you're a bit of a paradox. When I look at your Twitter profile, it says leader, follower, reader, writer, speaker, listener, student, teacher. It says discipline equals freedom. On one hand, you had one of the most alpha roles imaginable as the commander of Task Unit Bruiser, and yet you cite humility as the most important quality of a leader. You say drop the ego, exercise humility, work as a team. I was wondering, do you ever find yourself trying to explain these two sides of your personality when people meet you?
Well, I always talk about the dichotomy of leadership. It's something I talk about all the time, and there's a dichotomy really with everything in life. There's a dichotomy. The dichotomy of leadership is very evident. You got all these opposing forces that are pulling you in different directions when it comes to leadership. You know, you've got to be aggressive to make things happen. I mean, if you're not aggressive with things, they don't happen, they don't move. And at the same time, if you're overly aggressive, you can, number one, you can put yourself in a bad situation. You can run to your death. Even with your team, if you're over aggressive with your team, all of a sudden you're overbearing and they're not wanting to give you any feedback because you're going to beat them up. So there's a dichotomy of everything. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why that's my little Twitter, what is that called? Profile?
I think so, yeah.
So that's why, you know, it's like, yeah, I am a student because I'm always looking to learn. But at the same time, I know I'm teaching people things. So that's just sort of the nature of life. And I think recognizing that dichotomy gives you a little bit of freedom, you know? It gives you a little bit of freedom to say, oh, I can go and do this. It's okay. And it doesn't mean I can't do the other thing on the other side.
And I think I've heard you say that sometimes you're in the situation in your head, and then sometimes you're constantly stepping out and saying, observing yourself and observing the situation, not from, say, Jocko's perspective, but from, say, another perspective, and then coming back into your head. Do you find that you do that more now in your business life, or were you always doing that as a SEAL?
Like I said, I mean, I learned that being a SEAL, because if you get caught up in that chaos, you're not going to be able to make the right decisions. And so you have to be able to detach. And then when I started kind of expanding that into the rest of my life, yeah, and I saw improvement in my life. You know, the more detached I came from the emotion and from the meat of humanity, the more I got out of my own head, I seemed to do better. And then, yeah, I'll be working with businesses and having a conversation with somebody and sitting there thinking to myself, how, you know, from the outside, how is this being perceived? What are they thinking? What's their reaction going to be? And I can see that from a clearer view when I'm not wrapped inside my own emotional, crazy mind.
I think people are craving for some realness, you know, and I think people are tired of the political correctness. I had a guest in here named Dan Pena, and he says political correctness is the manifestation of lack of self-esteem. I don't know if he's right, but I've been thinking about that a lot. And if you see, say, the emergence of Trump, love or hate Trump, you have to admit he is winning in the polls. And is that a sign that people are tired of the Hollywood answer, the politician's answer, the straight answer that helps their business model or gets them more Twitter followers, and that they can sense and crave someone who's got a real, true message?
I'd say you're probably right. I do think that that's what's fueling, Donald Trump's rise, is that he's speaking his mind. There's no doubt about it. He's speaking his mind. Now, maybe he's in the background calculating it, but it certainly comes off as he's speaking his mind and he's saying what he wants to say. And I do think people are, over the whole politically correct thing. Seems like they're over that. And I would say I agree with that.
Okay.
That sentiment.
And do you think that's why people like to listen to what you're saying to a certain extent?
Perhaps.
Right.
Perhaps. But honestly, I don't really talk about politics that much, which is a little bit strange because I talk about war all the time. My podcast is about war for the most part. But at a certain point, war is no longer political. When you get on the battlefield, it is no longer a political thing. It's a raw struggle of will against human against human. And so that's the sort of thing that I guess people do like to talk about.
Okay. I want to talk about your experiences in war. First, can you tell me about, going to BUD/S in San Diego, where I'm from, and that whole process of just even wanting to be a SEAL? And you've spoken about this a little bit before, but I was wondering if you could tell people why that, and was that always the only option? Like when you were in your teens, I was going to go and do that.
Yeah, I always wanted to be a commando ever since I was a little kid, and I heard that the SEALs were really tough and that the training was really tough, and so that's the one I went to. And I also heard that they were stationed in San Diego, which I grew up surfing in New England, and so to have an opportunity to go be stationed where there's legitimate great waves all the time, I was all over it. So that's one of the major reasons why I picked the Navy and the SEAL teams. And then, once you get in, everyone makes a big deal out of BUD/S, but it's in the SEAL teams, it's no big deal. Everyone goes through it. You get cold, you get wet, whatever. You do a bunch of push-ups and pull-ups and dips, but it's anyone that gets to the SEAL teams and does deployments overseas and has a real career, they're not talking about BUD/S training.
Okay.
It just doesn't mean anything. I wasn't a great athlete. You got kids in there that ran college track or swam in college, and anybody that ran college track or college cross country is going to breeze through every run. Anybody that swam is going to have no problem with the swimming. But it finds people's weaknesses. And so I was like a gray man that was just in the middle of everything. I was in the middle of the pack on the runs, I was in the middle of the pack on the swims, I was in the middle of the pack on the obstacle courses. I was just in the middle of the pack. But when you had guys that excelled in some areas, some guys just were really good athletes and they excelled in everything. But some guys excelled in one area. They were incredible runners, but they couldn't swim and they wouldn't make it. I had guys, I don't know if I've ever said this on a podcast before, but I had a guy that was, a NCAA water polo team captain champion, and he quit. And I had a guy that was an Olympic alternate gymnast, and he quit. So those are two guys that are way better athletes than I would ever be, but they quit. And the same thing you find is when you get to the SEAL teams, just because someone's a good physical athlete, it doesn't mean that they're a good SEAL, because being a good SEAL is a lot more than just being a good athlete. In fact, being a good athlete is like the baseline. And it's everything that you learn to do after that makes you a good SEAL.
And what makes a good SEAL?
A guy that's a good leader, a guy that's tactically sound, a guy that makes good decisions, a guy that's good under pressure, a guy that doesn't ever give up on trying to accomplish a mission. So those are the things that make a good SEAL, not just being able to run fast. You're constantly growing in the SEAL teams. Every time you go through a workup, which is our training cycle, you're getting better, you're getting more efficient, you're getting more confident with what you're doing. So you're always learning and growing. And I was always learning until the day I retired, because it's not a boom, this happened and everything changed. It's a constant addition of skill set and repetition of situations where you become competent at your job.
And how many years was it until your first deployment?
Well, you're doing deployments even in the dry years in the 90s. So I missed the first Gulf War. So when I first got to a SEAL team, we would deploy overseas, but we would deploy to train other countries and do exercises overseas. So I was doing that my whole life. And then my first combat deployment to Iraq was in 2003. And in fact, here's a good story. So one of my platoon commanders, this is when we got to Ramadi, one of the platoon commanders went out with about 8 of his guys or 7 of his guys. They went out accompanying a Army unit. The Army unit that is actually an Iraqi and an Army unit. The Iraqi Army unit that they were with had a very experienced U.S. Army guy that was going with them. That was their co-leader, right? So they had an American co-leader to help this Iraqi unit. And this guy had been in Ramadi, which was the worst city in Iraq. He'd been there for, 6 months, fighting in urban combat. And he was a reservist, and his civilian job, he was a cop. So the guy is a legit guy that's seen a lot of stuff and been in sustained combat, both in America and in Iraq. So they all got on this patrol. They get into a firefight. The platoon commander hunkers down behind a wall. There's rounds hitting the wall, and he's down there with this major. And he looks at the major and says, "Hey, sir, I can take my guys over. We'll get on some high ground. We'll flank him and kill him." The major's like, "Okay, go do it." So platoon commander gets down, crawls out, musters up the guys. They maneuver down a half a block, get up on a building. They flank the enemy. They kill them, drive them away, and come back. Yep. Mission's over. Come back to base. And I'm actually there. I met him at the gate when they came back from the op. And the major, and again, this guy has all kinds of experience, and this was the first real op that this platoon commander had run and been in a firefight on. So they come back, and the major says to him, "Hey, Captain." He says Captain because the rank structure in the Navy is different from the Army, so he thought he was a captain when he was really a lieutenant. He says, "Hey, Captain, you did awesome out there. You must have been in a lot of urban combat." And the lieutenant, the platoon commander, looks at him and says, "Actually, sir, that was my first firefight." So the training that we get, the preparation that we do is very sufficient to prepare you for that. Now, all that being said, when you're in combat, now there's a possibility that you can die, you can get severely wounded. From my perspective, I was never worried about that because didn't care. The thing that you're worried about from a leadership position is you're worried about your guys. You're worried about one of your guys getting hurt. You're worried about one of your guys getting killed. And that just completely trumps every other emotion that you have. You're seeing your guys and you're looking and you're saying, okay, is this guy doing the right thing? Pull this guy over there. There's a threat over there. How do we handle that? That's what's on your mind. The fear of getting shot or killed is not on your mind when you're in the moment. It'll build up when you're waiting to go out. There's times you're waiting to go out and you're like thinking to yourself, okay, there's a lot of bad things going on out there and some of them could happen to me. But I think at some point you realize that there's nothing you can do about that. Other than just quit and just resign yourself to a life of cowardice. But if you opt to not do that and you step up and say, okay, I'm ready. And if I die, I die. And once you overcome that, then nothing else to be afraid of.
You said early on you were prepared and almost expecting to die in battle.
I don't know if I was expecting to die in battle, but I was okay with it. And I think you go crazy when you're not okay with it. Right. I think it just, you gotta realize that if it happens, it's gonna happen.
I want to talk about Ramadi, but I want to contrast it with your first tour in Iraq. 2003, you've been kind of waiting 13 years, you've been preparing, wanting a combat situation. I'm guessing, if you prepare this for your whole life, I'm guessing you really want to do that. What's it like when it comes?
Yeah. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to go into combat. I'd be grossly lying. I always wanted to go into combat since I was a little kid. And when it happened, I was happy it was happening. And when we were done, I wanted more.
And I think you've described it as you were kind of, I think you described it as Baghdad SWAT at one point. You were out gunning everybody. You were coming in, doing the business, some resistance, but you were very dominant at the time.
Yeah, we dominated. Yeah.
6 months you're in, you go back after 6 months. Had things quieted down? Like, did you feel like, I wish I would have stayed, or had a lot of the action and stuff happening finished and you were like, okay?
Well, we came back thinking that we had a great deployment because we did a lot of operations, killed a significant amount of bad guys. So that felt like, hey, we did our job. But what happened at the end of, actually middle of 2004, it was happening as we left, but you started to hear a different word over there, and that was insurgency. And what that meant was this was no longer just former Saddam thugs or criminal elements that were out there just trying to cause problems and make money and do bad things. All of a sudden you had the insurgency is organized, and they started to conduct organized operations against American forces. And that was, so now I was home and things started to get worse and worse and worse. And so I knew when I was going back, it was going to be a different story.
Were you pretty sure you were going to go back when you got home in 2004?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So the more information that you get about what's going on over there, you probably prepare specifically for that when you're back in the States.
We do. And that being said, we always prepare a broad skill set. You know, even though it's in the middle of the desert, we still do water work. Even though we're mostly using vehicles, we're still jumping out of airplanes and fast roping out of helicopters. So we maintain the well-rounded skill set, even if because you never know for sure. Even if we strongly believe that we're going to be going to one area, we're ready for anything.
And those live action drills are jumping out of helicopters, live fire stuff. I think you've talked about it where if you're using paint guns, if you do get killed, your unit has to carry you back. I mean, it's really, you're putting a lot of taxation on your fellow man when you do these drills, and these things can last a long time.
Well, yeah, the training operations, just depending on what type of mission it is. But the type that you're talking about where you're carrying a downed man out of the desert, you might be carrying him for 5 or 6 kilometers. It's not fun.
Okay. And with the paint guns and all the gear, does it do a very good job of simulating pieces? I mean, without that, would it change the actual combat situation?
The best thing about it is you can fight against other humans. And if you compare it to martial arts, it's like in the 60s or 70s when martial arts was theoretical. And it was, well, if I would have hit you there, it would have caused you to do this, and therefore I would have beat you in a fight. And as we found out with the UFC coming out and saying, okay, the first UFCs were awesome, where it's just style against style, no time limit, no rules. It doesn't get any better than that. And that's when we figured out what worked and what didn't work. And so with the simunition, you found out, again, you're allowed to fight against another human. Because prior to that, if you only have live fire, you're just shooting against paper targets. Paper targets don't shoot back, number one. Number two, they don't move. So what makes combat, I mean, the crux of combat is maneuver. Being able to move. And the way you do that is fire and move, cover and move. So one element is shooting and keeping the enemy's head down while the other element maneuvers. That's what combat is. That's the basis of combat, is cover and move or fire and maneuver. And so when you take away the ability of the enemy to maneuver because they're made of paper, well, then you're not really challenging yourself. So once we had simunition or paintball or laser tag or whatever mechanism we used, where the enemy could now maneuver on us, the enemy being other SEALs that were role-playing as enemy, well, now the challenge was that much greater, and we got to figure out what worked, and we got to be that much more prepared for the combat situations.
And you're using those laser tag guns that can shoot out to a couple hundred meters.
Right.
And you got GPSs on everybody.
Yep.
So you can go back and analyze this whole thing on a Google map and really see what's working, what's not working.
That's what it is.
Were you feel like you were really climbing a steep learning curve when you were doing that? And you were like, okay, this is really going to pay off when we get into battle?
Really, the mechanism of the really good laser tag came after I got back from Ramadi. But what I had on my side was I had experience And I had paid attention to my elders when I was a kid. And when I was getting trained and there was no war going on and it was the 90s, and I'd hear a guy, you know, someone whose name you'll never hear, but a guy that if you're in the SEAL teams, you know who that person is because they were a legit badass Vietnam war hero. You'd hear them say something. I would hear them say something and I would collect that and I would hang on to it. And, you know, and cover and move is a great example. This is a principle that's one of the most basic principles in combat, and you wouldn't really hear it that often. And when I first heard an old badass Vietnam SEAL explain that very briefly, didn't make a big deal out of it, but it just stuck. And that was the main principle that keeps people alive on the battlefield, is cover and move. So that's what prepared me, was that experience of growing up with listening to my elders, and then luckily having deployments where they weren't that bad, and when I came back I could drill guys and push them hard and prepare them. And so that's what it was. It was really just the experience and the listening to the elders and paying attention. The SEAL team doctrine wasn't written down anywhere. It was all word of mouth and passed down from generation to generation that way. And making sure that you're not being cocky, making sure that you don't have the attitude that you talked about earlier of, you know, we're always going to be better than the enemy. We're always going to win, because you're not always going to win. And especially if you think you're always going to win, then you're not going to prepare that the way you should. You're not going to give everything you can to your training to making sure that you are prepared for that moment when it comes. And it might come once on a deployment, it might not come on a deployment, and it might come on a daily basis.
Will that always be an issue with the military, as far as this, the knowledge base will kind of taper out in between conflicts and come back? Or is there a way to preserve it now through video, through highly documenting things? Or will we always have that lag?
Unfortunately, when there's peace, there's no longer a focus on war. And so people easily forget that that should be the priority. You know, we changed the Department of War to the Department of Defense. You know, it used to be the Department of War. So when that's the attitude, of course you're going to lose it, because the focus very quickly turns from war fighting to whatever else, administration. And so I think you're always going to lose some of the knowledge in between wars.
So it's 2004, 2005. You're starting to hear back that things are really changing in Iraq. And I'm guessing you're already starting to prepare for a second deployment out there. And I just wanted to ask, this organization that happened, and I want to hear more what it was like that first week in Ramadi, that they started doing, was that something that they had been planning for years, or was it just a natural progression of what happened, you know, when we first went in and them doing the regrouping?
No, it was because the folks that were regrouping, that were organizing the regrouping, were not Iraqis. They were foreigners. They were Al-Qaeda coming in from other areas, from Syria, from all over. They were coming in there, they were starting to organize, they had the financial backing. So that was who was organizing it. It wasn't the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people were happy to be rid of Saddam and looking forward to living in some kind of a peaceful society. And then in come the insurgents and the extremists and the terrorists who have their own plans.
Is it more about money than it is about religious freedom or a jihad? Is it really, are these guys gangsters just running numbers in a money rocket in the end of the day? Or is there a lot of blurred lines as to why people are fighting?
It's both. It's both. They are definitely power hungry. They're money hungry and power hungry. And I guess you could say that roots back to they want money so they can fuel their viewpoints, but it's all combined. They want power.
Because it always strikes me that fight happened in Ramadi. It didn't happen, you know, in the middle of the desert somewhere in the Sahara where there's no resources. Right. Like, it's happening there for a reason.
It's happening there for a reason.
You get back to Ramadi in 2006. When you land on the ground, how does it feel different, if it already does? And what's that first few days like in contrast to your first tour?
Well, almost immediately we're going to memorial services for Army guys, Marines that are killed, which, you know, was a rude awakening. So that's the welcome to Ramadi. The welcome to Ramadi is, you know, you're going to go and pay your respects to some guys that were just killed. And there's firefights in the city. So we're just across the river from the city. There's firefights in the city all day. There's firefights in the city all night. We're on the rooftop of our building. You can sit there and watch tracer fire go back and forth. We're shot at from, you know, across the riverbank. There's, yeah, it was legit. It was legit combat. It was a legit bad scenario with sustained combat operations.
How do you lead your men through that when you know they're dealing with not only the funerals, which definitely take a psychological toll, but then even that just constant firefighting over there? I mean, do you have to switch up your gear and think, okay, I got to lead stronger or maybe a little easier in certain scenarios? Are you changing a little
Yes,
bit?
you do have to modulate your leadership. And you have to do that if you're in the business world. You have to do that if you're leading any kind of team. You've got to modulate, and you got to recognize when your guys need to be pushed and when your guys need to be not pushed and given a rest. So you're constantly doing that, regardless of what kind of team you're leading. And in combat, like, you know, I say all the time, it's amplified, because if you push your guys too hard in combat, they're going to break. You know, whereas in business, oh, maybe they make errors on something, or maybe they do snap. I mean, it does happen in the business world where people like can't take it anymore. But in combat, it'll happen very quickly. And so, you know, you're constantly modulating and taking measure of where your guys are at. And, you know, sometimes I didn't do a great job of that. Sometimes I went a little far and said, ooh, wow, I just saw the look on that guy's face. He needs a rest. And I should have recognized that earlier. And, you know, you make mistakes, no doubt.
Those first few weeks in Ramadi, what are you assessing? What are you deciding that you have to do differently? And what are you as a unit? I know there's a lot of other units there. What are you deciding you need to do, you know, very differently than the previous tour?
Well, one of the biggest things was the strategy. The strategy while I was there on my first deployment, and the strategy throughout the beginning of the Iraq War, all the way up until 2006, was to go out and capture or kill the bad guys. You know, you find out where these insurgents are, you find out where these terrorists are, go out, capture and kill them. So that was the strategy. And the thought was, and it's a very common thought, and it's one of those sentences that makes so much sense that everyone believes it. And that is, if you cut off the head of the snake dies, right? That's a common thought and statement, because it's true, right? If I cut off the head of the snake dies. So the thought was, if we can cut off the head of the snake, meaning the leadership of the insurgents, then the snake will die, the insurgents will die. And it's just not true. It's just not true. And there was a group of US military people that knew this. And General Petraeus was one of them, who wrote the counterinsurgency manual, along with a core group of really, I don't know if they take this as an insult. I take it as an insult. They probably don't, but intellectuals. Guys that were intellectuals, guys that were smart. H.R. McMaster, General Petraeus, a guy that I ended up working for, Colonel Sean McFarland. Those guys understood that cutting off the head of the snake, the snake grows another head. And what you have to do is you have to change the environment that the snake is in. And so the battle, the decisive terrain in this battle was not a building or a mountain or an airfield like it would be in World War II. The decisive terrain was the people, it was the populace, it was the local populace of Iraq that are normal people that wanted to live simple, peaceful lives. So they recognized that, and they brought in a new strategy, which was, hey, look, we're going to continue to do those operations, because part of counterinsurgency is to go out and still capture and kill bad guys, of course. But what you have to do is you have to secure the populace. You have to make the populace feel that you are the stronger side and that they don't have to live in fear of the insurgents. And so that strategy was called Seize, Clear, Hold, and Build. And when the 1-1 AD, which was the large brigade of soldiers and Marines that came in and took over Ramadi from the last unit that was there. So when we arrived in Ramadi, it was a reservist unit, and they were awesome guys, the 228 out of Pennsylvania. And if you don't know what a reservist is, in England, it's the TA. It's people that are, plumbers and physicians and drivers and normal teachers, just civilians that they do whatever it is, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks in the summer. But all of a sudden they get called up, their number gets pulled, and there they are, they're in Ramadi. They were there for 14 months. They fought heroically, did an amazing job. And by the time we got there, they were battle-hardened warriors. But it was their turn to go home. So in to take their place was this armored brigade called the 11AD, the Ready First Armored Brigade, the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division. They came in to take over, and they brought in Sean McFarland, who, like I said, was an incredibly smart guy who had, again, experience plays a big role. He had been in northern Iraq in a city called Tal Afar, where this other Colonel McMaster had used this strategy up there and won and pacified the city. And he turned over with Sean McFarland, and Colonel McFarland then came to Ramadi and knew the strategy to use, which was completely different than what we'd been doing. It was a lot more risky, it was a lot more aggressive, and it was the right thing to do, which is go into these enemy-controlled neighborhoods and build these combat outposts, these reinforced buildings where coalition forces, meaning both American soldiers and Iraqis, would go there and live and stay and drive out the insurgents, not just one night, go get a bad guy and leave, but stay there permanently and drive out those insurgents from those areas and protect the local populace so the local populace could live in peace, turn against the insurgents, and finish them off.
Do you remember your first reaction when you heard about that strategy? Such a counterintuitive strategy to say the previous.
Well, I actually, when I got over there and I saw that what we had been doing, what we, America, had been doing, and I saw the same type of target lists of bad guys, which when I left, there was a big target list of bad guys. When I got back 2.5 years later, there's a big target list of bad guys. Something wasn't working. So I immediately started thinking to myself, what can we do differently? And I actually literally sat down and pulled, there's a counterinsurgency manual written by, again, the US Army wrote it. I literally sat down my first night in Ramadi, or maybe it was my second night, pulled it off, it's on the internet. I had to pull it off the internet. Didn't even have a copy of it, pulled it off the internet, read the whole thing. I said, we've got to help people do this. And then it was just, I guess, coincidence that McFarland showed up with that plan, and I knew then, okay, he's going to execute counterinsurgency. This is how we can help them.
And is the crux of that strategy that you go into the local population and you show them that you are here to stay?
Absolutely.
And is it encourage them to a certain extent to separate from those, those terrorist elements there?
It does.
Okay.
So if you're in America, if you're in a gang-ridden part of town, you're not listening to what the cops say. You're listening to what the gang says. They tell you to do something, you're going to do it. Otherwise, they come in, break in your house, and kill you. That's what the insurgents did. So the local populace, it was pretty much passive support, meaning, look, we just don't want you to kill us. So go ahead. You want to use my building to launch mortars? Use my building to launch mortars. You want to take some of our bread? Take the bread. Just don't kill us. But they were living in fear. And because when they did step out of line, guess what? They were getting brutally murdered. They were getting tortured. They were getting raped. It was awful. So they didn't want it, but they had no choice. They didn't have the strength to stand up against the insurgents. Well, guess who does? We do. And so when we went into those neighborhoods and said, listen, we're not going away. We're staying right there. We'll be back here tomorrow to help you. We'll be back here the day after that to help you again. You need water, you need food, you need medical attention. That's what we're here to do. We're here to help. And when they realized that, that's when they switched to our side. And I say switched, it wasn't that they were on the insurgent side, but they were providing passive support because they were living in so much fear. But as soon as they realized that we were the stronger tribe, then they said, you know what? Thank you. Thank you. By the way, there's a bad guy that's staying in a building 4 doors down. Go get him. We can take care of that.
And that's 99% of the people in that city? Is it that skewed of people that just want to live their life, that don't want to be terrorized?
It's a vast majority of the people. When you'd go into their house, especially after we had established ourselves, when we'd go into their houses, they would, give you the smile. The kids would talk to you. They'd be talking with the Iraqi soldiers. Yeah, absolute majority. And this is something that you don't, it's very hard to get this through the media because, you know, when's the last time you saw a news story on, you know, on an American cable news company or cable news program of an American family going to the store to go grocery shopping? Have you ever seen that?
No.
No, because it's not news. But when you see people rioting in the streets, of course you see that, because that's.
To watch the rest of this fascinating interview, click on the link below and go to londonrealacademy.com. There you can sign in with your social media login and watch the rest of the episode for free, along with all of our episodes on London Real, my webinars, and all of our premium content, all located over at londonrealacademy.com. So click on the link below, you'll be directed there and you can watch the rest of this fascinating interview, and I'll see you there.
And that's what they wanted. And so really when we pulled out completely, it didn't take